pick the pattern that you like in the square, and then pick the brand of the dress, the version of the dress that you like. And so they make a lot of money. But again, their business couldn't exist without the telegraph and the railroad. Again, much like Jeff Bezos can't sell us infinite objects in the infinite store without the internet and the computer to allow us to search for exactly what we want, right? And so you cannot overestimate the railroad's importance in the 19th century. It's behind every major business. Every business exists in the scale that it does because the railroad enables them to get cheap transport, right? Carnegie can't be shipping 10,000 tons of coal a week, or steel or iron. Rockefeller ships oil over the country. None of those things exist, right, without the railroad. Morgan and Vanderbilt go hand in hand because the only way Vanderbilt could build the railroads he did was by getting loans from Morgan, and that's how Morgan's bank is so big, right? It's railroad loans. Right? And everybody, no one will not lend money to a railroad because the railroads go bust all the time. On the other hand, when they don't go bust, they become, the biggest businesses around. So it's always probably worth it, right? The American government lends millions and millions of dollars tax-free to the railroads in the 19th century, solely with the intent that the railroads will build railroads, right? You're going to build a railroad through Kansas, here's a bunch of money tax-free, just take it. On the off chance that you'll do it, it would be worth it, right? They give land tax-free to the railroads equal to 1.5 times the size of the state of Texas for free. Why? Because the railroads would build a railroad through it if you gave it to them, so you give it to them and they will. And of course, for the railroad, this is a sweetheart deal. You take a big chunk of land that's valueless, you build a railroad through it, and then you sell the adjoining parcels, which are now very valuable because they're next to a railroad, right? And so the railroads make a huge amount of money. And of course, the railroads are involved in the biggest corruption around, right? Every corruption story is a railroad story, whether or not it intended to be. My favorite one is that the railroads told an engineer who had a team of guys building a railroad, they would give him a bonus if by a certain date he would build a railroad to the edge of this town, or into the town or further. So it looks like they're doing okay, and when they get right down to the wire, it turns out that they're not going to make it. So the railroad engineer goes to the town, and the bonus he's going to get is like $20,000 from the railroad. So he says to the clerk of the town, I want you to get a measure approved by the town council that will expand the boundary of the town to this point, and I'll give you $5,000. And so the clerk says, okay, and they make it happen. And so at the end of the day, the railroad guy builds 1 foot of track over the line, which is now part of the town, and it didn't used to be, and he collects $20,000 from the railroad and gives the clerk $5,000. Right? And so that's a relatively harmless thing. It's not anything bad, but it tells you the amount of money that's flowing around the railroad. There's just so much money that things like that become sort of commonplace, right? And so the holy grail of the railroad is the Transcontinental Railroad, a railroad that would connect California's railroads to everything east of the Mississippi. And if you remember your pre-Civil War days, one of the driving events before the Civil War was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which upended the Missouri Compromise. And what was it about? It was about railroads. It was really about railroads. It wasn't about slavery in that one instance. It was about railroads, but it turned out to be about slavery because of it. And so it finally happens in the 1870s. They link the Pacific and the East Coast Railways together at Promontory Point, Utah. It's during Grant's administration, like 1874. And Grant drives a golden spike into the railroad tracks to celebrate it all, right? But now, only on one railroad track, but now you can get on the railroad anywhere in the East Coast and go all the way to California, and you will have to switch trains, but you will not have to do anything not on a train, right? You won't have to ride a horse, you won't have to ride a boat, you won't have to ride a carriage, you won't have to walk. And so understandably that will be more as time goes on. It's just one railroad track at the beginning, but that's still an enormous, huge thing. That now we can, for example, export food from California, and we can export manufactured goods from the East, and you can make a ton of money swapping those things around. Chicago basically exists the way that it does because it emerges as the railroad hub of the upper Midwest. Right? That's the thing that Chicago has going forward in the 1870s, which is why it becomes this just huge city. Right? And so, in any case, having beaten railroads to death with a stick, we can move on, right? So now all we have to talk about the big cities, which is where all of this occurs, right? And so a few things that we can mention about the cities. The cities are not generally great places to live, as it turns out. One historian called the city the best invention that man ever had. It's hard to argue with that in the sense that cities are where most of the interesting things that have ever happened have happened because that's where all the people are. On the other hand, in the 19th century, cities are not that great, as it turns out. The big thing is the cities grow so fast over the 19th century that they're not really able to accommodate the huge onrush of population, right? It turns out if you're going to build a factory, the city is the obvious place for the factory, right? It's where the railroad is, it's where the harbor is, it's where all the people are, so all the workers are, it's where all the raw materials are going to be. But when the factories go up, the workers crowd in. There's not really a place for them to live. And so you can see this is a tenement in New York City, probably. And what the tenements often are repurposed apartment buildings from before the Industrial Revolution, where this might have been like, each of those apartments might have been for like a single family. And so what they do is they subdivide them into like 4 or 5 apartments, and then rent them to families of workers, right? And so around the late 19th century, turn of the 20th century, Jakob Riis is a photographer who takes pictures of these things. And you can see he publishes a book called How the Other Half Lives. And it's very influential. And it's sort of a picture book about what tenements and working class life actually looks like. So here you can see this is a room that's being rented to, it looks like at least 6 or 8 people. Who sleep there. One guy that Riis took a picture of, he rented a 2x4 over 2 barrels, and that was his bed. At night, he would go to the sub-basement of a tenement, and he would take the 2x4 and put it on the 2 barrels and sleep on that, and like he paid, that was where he lived, that was what he paid for. And part of it was that there wasn't a lot of available housing, right? There was a huge demand for housing and very little supply. Part of it was that wages tended to be so low that this was what people were willing to pay for, so what they could afford, right? In Massachusetts in the 20s, there was a whole case involving the minimum wages and safety for bakers, because it turned out people did not like to learn that the bakers every day would go to work in the bakeries, and when the bakeries closed for the day, they would clean off the tables, and then they would sleep on the tables where they needed the bread, because the bakers couldn't afford to live anywhere else, and they knew that was one place that was going to be used at night, so they would go to sleep on the tables where they would roll the bread, and then in the morning they would just get up, put the blankets under the table, clean off the table, and go back to work. And so people were horrified to know that bakers were living like that, but that was the wages that they were being paid, right? And so you can see here, this is a little bit better off of family. And so this is certainly in New York City. You can see there is the husband and the wife, and they've got 5 kids in the 1-room apartment. And so they're pretty well off as things go. The kids are pretty nicely dressed. There's some nice furniture. They've got some nice dishes in the cabinet. But even for a family that's a little bit more well off, space in New York City is at a premium, right? Even today, if you have a pretty good job, an apartment in New York City that's 1,000 square feet can run north of like $2,000 a month. And so probably much more than that. And so if you remember, if you know anyone who grew up in New York City in the 20th century, space was always at a premium. It's expensive to have private space. No one else, only rich people generally did. And so most workers that we're going to talk about tended to live in places like this. They had no air conditioning, hadn't been invented, no heating in the winter to speak of. They were terrible fire hazards. They usually were dirty. There was no running water, hot or cold. They usually had 1 bathroom per floor or 1 bathroom per building, which inevitably would become backed up all of the time. There was no garbage pickup, so there's just a dump out back. You throw your garbage in the back. So they were alive with rats and animals and this kind of thing. I want to say it was New York City was considered ahead of its time, because in the 19th century, if a horse died in a public street, you could call and they would remove the body. But like if anything else died, it would be like, well, it'll just go away on its own, right? And most cities didn't even do that. If a horse died, it'd be like, well, shove it on the side of the road. Someone will come along and cut it up for meat, or they'll just drag it away later, or whatever, right? And so public sanitation was non-existent, right? Cologne in Germany was considered to be, as Hamburg was a very progressive city because they had a very good sewer system. They drained the city waste, and also they put water pumped into every home. Even the tenements had cold water, so that you could boil water. And then it turns out they got cholera, which was bad. And so that was very devastating for the nice burghers in Hamburg, because in the 19th century in England, they discovered that cholera is an epidemic disease that spreads very easily in people, and then they figured the source of it out. It was a little district in London got cholera, and they couldn't figure it out. And then a lady across town got cholera. So they asked her, like, what do you do? Like, everybody in, like, over there in the in the East End has cholera, and you're the only person in like a 5-block radius that has cholera. And she said, well, I used to live there, And she said, I used to live in a little square in that little district of London, and there's a well. And I really like the taste of water from that well, so I pay a kid in my neighborhood every day to go over, get a bucket of that water, and I make my tea out of that water. He dumps it in a pot, and I boil it every day. And so they drained the well in the district of the cholera, and they found a sewer pipe had burst and was leaking into the well. And that's how they figured it out, is they asked the one lady who had cholera in West London what she had to do with all the people in cholera who had cholera in East London, and it was the water, right? And it turns out cholera is spread when bacteria from the human digestive system gets into water, and the typical way it does is through, if you drink water that's got human waste, right? Typically feces. And so when Hamburg got a cholera epidemic, it meant that there was shit in the water supply, which was very bad. But on the other hand, imagine living in Hamburg where there actually is a city municipal water supply that they really care about, right? Most cities don't even have that. They don't have anything resembling a hand pump behind the tenement that you live in, right? Which of course means there's a line every day to pump water for washing and for drinking and all that kind of stuff, right? And so, having said that, most of these sort of basic amenities that we consider part of modern urban life, garbage pickup, street lights and stuff, really kind of came later, right? The other thing you can mention is the enormous urban population that comes from immigration, right? This is a particularly concerning topic to people in the 19th century, but it's not a new one, right? Obviously, immigration has been a constant in American history since 1607, when everyone who's not a Native American is an immigrant at some level, right? That's certainly true. There had been immigration scares beforehand. Before the Civil War, the Know Nothing Party was the first really anti-immigrant party in American history. Abraham Lincoln and a lot of Republicans didn't like the Know Nothings, but they wanted their votes, so they kind of had to play that game because you needed to win elections. And so the big thing that changes after the Civil War is that immigration skyrockets, but it's from different areas, and that's the thing that really sort of changes. First, there's one kind of immigration that's been a constant in American history, which you can call like internal migration. And this is people traveling around a country to get work, right? And so the internal migration in America tends to be from rural areas at this point to urban areas, right? And so it's anywhere rural to anywhere urban, because that's where the jobs are. Over the course of the 20th century, the internal migration in America has often been from the north to the south and west, right? People moving out of the northeast or the upper Midwest going south, going west. States like Texas, Florida, California had had their population grow. States like Ohio, New York had their population go down. In the 19th century, it's predominantly rural people going into urban areas to get jobs, right? And it makes perfect sense. You're in the farm, you look around, what are you gonna do when you're an adult in the farm community? You're gonna farm. If you're not excited by the prospect of cow shit for the rest of your life, you get on the train and you go to the big city because there's factory jobs. And you can make good money, and everything exciting is happening in the city. There's all kinds of people, there's art, there's music, there's social life, there's all sorts of things that can happen, right? For the first time, young women in their late teens and early 20s have this experience of essentially being like an independent adult where they're not a kid and they're not married to somebody. Because for a long time in most of the world, if you're a young woman, you live in your parents' house until the point in which you're an adult, then you get married and you move right in with your family and you start a family, you get married, you have kids. And so the idea that like today we have lots and lots and lots of people who don't do that, that's an unusual thing to happen to someone in the 21st century. And so you go to college, you live on your own, you have a job, then you get married later and move in with somebody. That's the norm today. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, that was very unusual, and it never really happened to young women. It does. And a lot of women, they really like that. They like the idea that they can go to the big city, get an apartment with a bunch of other girls, go to a boarding house, but like live on their own, get a job, make money, and not have someone dictate how their life works, not have the money belong to their husband or parents or whatever. And so the other thing we can mention that is foreign immigration. This is the thing. There is a huge peak of foreign immigration. It's more than had been coming before the Civil War, but it's also anxiety-inducing for people because these immigrants are coming from places that have not traditionally contributed large amounts of immigrants to America before. And so particularly Eastern Europe and Southern Europe on the East Coast and China on the West Coast. And so there have been European immigrants before, but now after the Civil War, you're getting people like Greeks, Italians, you're getting Eastern Europeans, Scandinavians less, Germans less, but more people like Romanians, Hungarians, Polish people, Russians, and large numbers of people who don't speak European languages that most Americans are familiar with, like German, French, and Spanish, or English. And they also are from religious groups that people don't know, Eastern Orthodox churches, Jews, particularly very Orthodox Jews. Right? That's the thing that was new. There were Jews in America for a long time. There was Israel Putnam was a guy who commanded artillery in George Washington's army. So I mean, like, it's clearly he's Jewish, right? On the other hand, they were mostly Western European assimilated, what would come to be known as Reform Jews. In Eastern Europe, the Jews that immigrated from Russia and from Poland tend to be deeply, deeply religious Orthodox Jews or conservative Jews. And so that's very different. People who speak Yiddish and people who keep kosher, that's like a thing that people have never seen. And so what you would almost instantly get in the big cities are those creation of those immigrant neighborhoods, right? Chinatown, the Upper East Side in New York City is where all the Jews live. They run the garment trade, and so all the garment factories are run by Jewish guys employing primarily Jewish labor. You get Little Italy, you get the Greek neighborhood, and it makes sense because if you're a Greek guy and you come over, where do you go? Well, you don't speak great English, so you go to the Greek Orthodox Church. There's a pretty good chance someone might know you or might know someone who knows you. You might be able to get a place to stay for a little while. You might be able to help someone get you a job. They go to their boss and like, oh, hey, this is my cousin's brother's friend's son.